Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. As you know, our last episode was on Alzheimer's disease and how it disproportionately impacts women. So, we thought it would be an interesting idea for us to do an episode on cognitive function. And for this conversation, I'm honored to have Dr. Yaakov Stern to share his knowledge and insights with us. Dr. Stern is a cognitive neuroscience, a neuropsychologist to be more precise. He's professor and chief of the cognitive neuroscience division at the Department of Neurology at Columbia University Medical Center in New York. He has published hundreds of papers in peer-reviewed scientific journals. He has edited a book called Cognitive Reserve. He is a globally known authority in the cognitive neuroscience space. His research focuses on cognition in normal aging and in diseases of aging. He is the proponent of the cognitive reserve hypothesis, a fascinating concept that explains why some individuals show more cognitive decline than others when facing neurodegenerative illnesses. So I'm very honored to have you here with us today, Dr. Stern, and have many questions about your work and its impact on brain and its development.
Yep, it's a pleasure to be here.
So before we dive into our questions about the work you've done, I wanted to mention that I read that your father had Alzheimer's disease. Was that a factor in your journey to study the cognitive function and focus on dementia?
No, it wasn't. He got Alzheimer's disease after I had been in this research area for a long time. It also turns out that my grandfather had it. When my grandfather had it, they didn't call it Alzheimer's disease; they called it senility. And it was only after I started doing work regarding Alzheimer's disease that I realized that my grandfather had it.
It's interesting because my grandmother had Alzheimer's disease as well. So I think there's always some residue that either directly or indirectly impacts our lives when, you have that experience living with a loved one that has the disease.
Yes.
So anyway, I would like to start by asking you to define for our listeners what is meant by cognitive function and is it related to the more commonly heard term brain plasticity?
Well, cognitive function is a very general term for people like me who are neuropsychologists and study this and measure it and test people that might be having cognitive problems. What we're thinking about are all these different things that the brain does. It could be memory, reasoning, processing things quickly, all kinds of language functions. All of those are cognitive functions of the brain. And over the years, people have developed different kinds of tests and evaluations of those functions.
And is it related to this brain plasticity that we hear a lot about, or is that something completely different?
Well, brain plasticity refers to the idea that maybe as we learn new things or as we experience new things, that the brain might change in some way and allow us to do better. So clearly, let's say you start to learn how to do math. Something in your brain has to alter in order to accommodate that new information. So in some way, that's brain plasticity. Other people, when they talk about brain plasticity, they're thinking of, well, let's say with aging, the brain is challenged. Can the brain come up with a different way of doing that activity? So
Right.
brain plasticity is a very, very general term and really depends on who's using it and in what context.
Mm-mm. We saw in your research that you've introduced this idea of cognitive reserve, which continues to be accepted and studied in the world of neuroscience and neurology. Can you, in simple terms, tell us what is cognitive reserve and why is it so important?
The idea of cognitive reserve, it relates to what we've just been discussing. So the brain is involved in multiple cognitive activities. As we age, the brain actually ages too. The actual brain itself shrinks. We can actually, with imaging, show that the volume of the brain gets smaller, the outside of the brain shrinks. There's whole sets of things that change that we can actually see with imaging. And then people who do deeper kinds of analyses can see that at other levels as well. So part of aging is cognitive change that has to do with this brain change. So we have a study where we're studying people 20 through 80 and following them over time. So even from 20 to 25, you can see changes in function on average. One good way of thinking about it for people who are sort of surprised by that idea, I think, is in sports, right, where you have people that are at top tuned up, optimally, but within a few years and at a very young age, they can't be baseball players anymore. They just don't have it anymore. That's on the physical level, but that happens on the brain level as well. So there's this brain change that happens just sort of naturally with aging that's related to changes in the brain. And then there's also diseases that impact cognition. So they're usually seen later in age, although not necessarily. So, like multiple sclerosis is a disease that younger people can get and can impact
Yeah.
brain function. Alzheimer's disease is one that usually happens much later in age. So there's two different kinds of ways that brain can be impacted, sort of what I would call normal aging and then disease-related aging. And the idea of cognitive reserve was developed to understand why some people can cope with these brain changes or disease pathologies better than others. So the idea is that two people can have the same amount of these brain changes, but one person can do better than another in the face of those brain changes. Why? Something about how the rest of the brain is working to do these activities, to do these functions, allows them to continue doing those functions or do them better than other people.
Hmm, very interesting. What influences an individual's cognitive reserve versus another? Is it like life experiences, life activities, sports, as you said, maybe music, art, social interactions? How does the cognitive reserve get developed, and what makes one individual's more or less than another?
That's a whole area of research that people have been engaged in for quite a while. I would say you mentioned a lot of the things that seem to be
Mm,
involved. I think, we can start with some people are born genetically with a sort of a higher IQ than others. So that's one piece of it. Another piece is all of these life exposures that you mentioned, starting from how babies and their families interact when they're young, the kind of education people get, the kinds of jobs people have, and are they cognitively stimulating jobs or different jobs, social engagement. I'm talking about, let's say, I'm sort of moving along in age, but throughout all of age, but like later in life, physical activity. There's a whole set of life exposures and things that people do that we can sort of measure and people investigate in research to see to what degree they might allow people to do better in the face of aging than other
mm.
people.
You mentioned some people are born with higher IQ. So is there a genetic component to cognitive reserve? And if so, do we know which genes are associated with these higher levels of cognitive reserve?
That's a the genes associated with cognitive reserve. We've been trying to think about that, but really the way that we've been thinking about it now is that there are genes associated with aspects of cognition or with IQ. It's sort of a genetic endowment that some people have, that everyone has, and some people might have more than others. And then that probably is a part of why some people can cope with age-related brain changes better than others. And it's only recently that we've been able to incorporate that into research. There's these very large studies that do genetic analysis and try to say, okay, what genes are associated with, let's just say, IQ. And there's multiple genes, and some of them, a set of them, have some influence or association with IQ. And then recently, there's a way to summarize that into a sort of a score, an IQ
Huh.
genetic score. This is something we're just doing much, just within the last couple of years as it's been. So we need to have blood and get the genetics of these people, and then we can calculate that. And we might be getting off on a bit of a tangent, but the idea is, well, what is part of the genetic endowment, and what is associated with life exposures? Both of those things affect aging in general, cognitive aging. Yeah, and then to some degree, the genetic component should be associated with cognitive reserve. But I think the part that we've focused on most is also, and that might be translated to IQ to some degree. But a lot of what
Mm,
we've also focused on are life exposures, the kind of work people did, the kind of education they got, all those things that we were talking about before.
very interesting. Does the age at which we enhance our daily functions matter? For example, could someone start early and someone else starts later in life, but they end up with the same level of cognitive reserve at a certain age?
Yeah, I think that each exposure throughout lifetime might contribute. I can contribute. I think the hopeful message for aging is that there's things people can do when they're older that are helpful, and each one contributes separately. So each one might contribute a little piece to the pie of your cognitive ability and your both your cognitive ability and your as we're talking about with cognitive reserve contribute to your ability to cope with brain changes. So I think the positive message is that it's never too late to do
Mm.
things that might impart cognitive reserve.
So it sounds like it's something that can continue to build over time, but does it diminish with diminishing activity like muscle mass? Like for 2 weeks, if you don't do any exercise, your muscle starts to deteriorate or atrophy. Is it similar?
That's a good question. So we're already talking about something very complicated. So I'll give you an idea of how we measure this. We can follow people over time. So like I told you, we have one study where we do a lot of our analyses. We have people 20 through 80. We test them. We have a lot of information about them. We've seen them 5 years later, 25 to 85, and now we're seeing them a third time. We can look at changes in their brain structure, changes in their brain. We can look at changes in cognitive function, and then we can look at things that seem to impact the relationship between the brain changes and the cognitive changes. The technical term is moderators. They
Mm,
moderate the impact of. So we can look at all of these different things and say, oh, we know that we have all these variables that we're talking about now, all these life exposures. How much do they seem to moderate the impact of brain change on cognitive change? So some people will, as we said, some people will cope better with the same amount of brain change than others. And then the next step that our group has been very interested in is there's ways to look at the brain in action, what's called
function.
functional MRI. And
Yeah.
so the next step is, okay, it's something that's going on in the brain. Can we begin to understand let's call it the networks that are underlying this cognitive reserve? So the cognitive
Mm,
reserve has to be going on in the brain. It's not just education, it's that education is doing something in the brain that allows people to cope better with these
mhm.
activity, with these brain changes or with disease. So that's sort of the area of work that I'm involved in.
Have you found any correlation with anatomical differences, like the physical size of the brain, the circumference of your head, or that correlates with the cognitive reserve?
No, what we found is that those kinds of measures can correlate with cognition or with other functions, but we mainly look at various aspects of cognition like memory and reasoning, speed of processing, those kinds of things. Though and there is though another concept that's called brain maintenance. And the idea of this concept of brain maintenance is that it could be that a lot of these exposures help people maintain their brains better. So there's two different things that can be going on. The brain maintenance talks about people maintaining their brains better and thus doing better throughout life. And the
Right.
cognitive reserve is more once the brains have changed, some people can cope with that better than others. So
Mm.
they're two parallel concepts. A lot of the things that are associated with cognitive reserve are also correlated with brain maintenance. So there's two things going on. There's this brain maintenance, which I think you're sort of thinking about. Some people can maintain their brains better. A couple of variables that I've seen are like we diet seems to be associated with better brain maintenance.
Right.
But I have a feeling that a lot of the same functions that we're talking about, physical activity, and are associated with better brain maintenance too. And then a totally separate process is the cognitive reserve process, where some people can cope better with those brain changes better.
So I've read that the circulatory system, for example, particularly the heart, has these compensatory mechanisms whereby there's some rerouting of blood flow as a preventive measure when people have blockage, which is a pretty smart defense mechanism. Does our brain have similar compensatory mechanisms where if we had an injury, let's say by some form of disease, it will call on these mechanisms to help. And then if it does have that, how do we know whether it's the cognitive reserve or these compensatory mechanisms at play?
Well, that's a very good question. Yeah, there are compensatory mechanisms on every level. I would say that you can start to think of, well, how cognitive reserve is implemented, right? So one idea could be that if some area of the brain that's associated with a specific function doesn't work as well, that area of the brain, people might use a compensatory,
Mm.
compensate for that by using another area of the brain. So that this idea of compensation is one particular way that cognitive reserve might be implemented.
Huh.
Yeah, and this is something that we've tried to look at, and there's a lot of research more generally, not even necessarily about cognitive reserve, but just about cognitive aging and compensatory mechanisms. So a very early paper about that was it seemed like that some people for some task used one area on one side of the brain, but some people used both sides of the brain, and perhaps they were compensating and doing better in the face of aging. So this
Huh.
compensatory ideas is a one that people have studied a lot. So yeah, so cognitive reserve could be on some level, okay, some area is that's associated with a cognitive function isn't working so well. I'll use another area. Another thing is that maybe some people don't need to use some brain network as much in order to get a job done. So let's say
So-
someone's great with math. It's very easy for them, just to give you an example. So
Right.
they can cope with more brain change because they have this greater efficiency of processing, just to get a little technical. And another is that maybe there's certain networks that some people can increase usage of much more than someone else. And so sort of what we call it capacity. Some people might have greater capacity. So these are all things that we try to study a bit using imaging and testing, but there a lot of it is just sort of theoretical ideas about how cognitive reserve might be implemented. And it's probably different for different people, and it's different for different cognitive functions. So it's a very it's
It's very complex.
complex, but
Yeah.
it's a basic idea. I think is a straightforward one, is that some people can cope with brain changes better than others because of something else the brain is doing. And then I think you sort of hinted at it. It could be, look, let's talk about Alzheimer's disease. It's a very bad disease. And no matter, how brilliant you are, if you have this disease and the pathology is bad enough, it will really impact you.
Yeah.
So there is a point where this reserve is just not going to help you anymore. I think in normal aging, normal cognitive aging, it probably is active throughout, but there's certain diseases that really just decimate the brain. So because cognitive reserve is run by the brain, if the brain is
Yeah.
damaged, all of a sudden, even if you were doing great before, that damage is going to cause cognitive problems. For those people that are listening that have had experience with someone with Alzheimer's disease, you see that.
Yeah. I noticed in some of the research, there's a reference to something called the ability neural network study. It's some large scale longitudinal study, which I believe tries to isolate brain activation and
Yeah.
morphological features. And can you explain that? What is the relevant, what is the study and what is its relevance to brain aging?
So that's the study that I've been talking about. We call it the
Mhm.
reference ability neural network study. The study is really designed to study cognitive aging. And this is the one I was telling you about, where we have people from 20 through 80 that started working.
Oh, yeah.
So this guy, Tim Salthouse, who's done a lot of work on cognitive aging, he proposed that there's four reference abilities. And I've been sort of talking about them: memory, reasoning, processing speed, and then language. And so memory speed and reasoning seem to decline with aging. Whereas as we've been talking about, there's certain things that actually get better with aging. And one of them is like vocabulary. We learn more words that we there's a few good things about aging. But so anyway, what he did is tried to summarize. There's multiple. We were talking in the beginning about all these different tests we can do to test aspects of cognition. He sort of said if you work with those four domains, you're pretty much covering what happens in cognitive aging. Now, he was doing that with cognitive testing. So what we decided to do at Columbia was we said, okay, can we also look at these reference abilities using brain imaging? So what we're doing is we're giving 12 tasks in the scanner to people. People are actually doing these tasks while we're scanning them. Three reasoning, three memory, three speed, and three vocabulary tasks. And the idea is to sort of look at cognitive aging, the cognitive functions that happen in aging, and see if we can see changes in the brain networks that we can measure with imaging as a function of age, and look at them. So the idea is really to try to understand cognitive aging on the imaging, on the functional imaging level.
What have you found? I'm curious.
So it's not surprising that we can. So now we follow people now 3 times, so we can now look not only, we really can look at these things very deeply. So we've been talking about, as time goes on, we can test them in the paper and pencil tests. We can give them these tests in the scanner as well. We can measure their brain changes with regular MRI, and then because we're giving these other tasks in the scanner, we can, let's just talk about memory. We can see sets of brain areas that are associated with memory, and then we can see what happens to those brain areas over time that might be associated with cognitive change. And then sitting on top of that is sort of a way to look at cognitive aging using this technique of brain imaging. And then on top of that, sort of a separate but built in, integrated, is this cognitive reserve idea. So the referenceability neural network study is there to understand cognitive aging better. We started with people that were all cognitively normal, even the oldest people, because we wanted to look at cognitive change. Some of those people that are older have developed cognitive problems over time, mild cognitive impairment we didn't talk about, which is sort of the precursor to, and then some have developed Alzheimer's disease. But really, that's a cognitive aging study that's pretty large, and we're really just so grateful for the people that are involved, because they do a lot. You can imagine they come in multiple.
Yeah.
Yeah, they just do a lot.
Well, being somebody who's very claustrophobic, asking people to be in the MRI to get a fMRI, you know,
Yeah,
it's just that alone, I think is a big ask
it is an
because
app. So not everybody
it's
can handle it. Yeah, and if they
no,
can't,
no, yeah.
go
And I
ahead.
was going to say it's interesting. You're not just studying memory, you're studying many other things.
That's what cognitive neuroscience and neuropsychology. So I'm also, I don't do it anymore, but I'm also a neuropsychologist who can test people. Let's say someone is thinking that they have a memory problem or a cognitive problem. They think they might have Alzheimer's disease. Probably some of your listeners are familiar with it. The same thing is done with children, let's say, that are having learning problems. So that testing always involves multiple cognitive processes. So most people think about aging, but one can think about many other things. So one is speed, how quickly you can solve a problem. One is sort of flexibility. It's called executive function. There's tests of language that you can give, like naming pictures or coming up with words that start with some letter. So these are all designed to test different functions, cognitive functions that the brain is in charge of. So you get a much bigger picture of someone's cognitive status, and like in the case where we're looking for someone that might have Alzheimer's disease, for example, we know that there are certain domains that are influenced earlier. So like memory is sort of a key one, although there's some people who
Mhm.
develop Alzheimer's disease and have some other cognitive change earlier, but most typically memory. And then, with those tests, you can use them to sort of the way that I've been talking about them to answer questions, theoretical questions about aging. But we also know because a lot of these tests are standardized how someone of a certain age and a certain education, let's say, should do. So we can say, oh, look at this. This person is really doing much more poorly than would be expected given their age and education and everything else we know about them. That might be a problem. So that's sort of the neuropsychology, more neuropsychology for diagnosis and for diagnosis. Yeah.
Right. It's interesting. You mentioned something that is making me have a question. You said something about the speed at which somebody can solve a problem or maybe name pictures. What would you say for someone who is bilingual, for example? Should they be having this test in their native language? I mean, they could be completely fluent in more than one language, but would that impact their ability to respond as quickly later in life on that second or third language?
You're opening up a very interesting area of research you're referring to. So uh, one is, first of all, let's say someone just speaks Spanish, it would be very unfair to test them in English, right?
Uh,
You have
yeah.
to, so these tasks have to be developed in a way that is appropriate for each language. Then this issue of bilingualism is a
Yeah.
very, very interesting area of research right now on a few levels, just like bilingualism can get very complex. Someone could have let's talk about the neighborhood here where our hospital is in North
Yeah.
Manhattan. A lot of people from Dominican Republic, a lot of Spanish speaking people. So some people, English is a second language. We have to decide, would it be better to test them in English or would it be better to
Yeah.
test them in Spanish? Sometimes they indicate the language that they're more comfortable. Yeah, but that would make a difference. And then there's whole area of study about could bilingualism or having multiple languages actually be helpful with aging? Part of it is that you can imagine that if people are bilingual, they can switch between these two languages, and that ability to switch strategy and that might be something useful that allows people to cope better with aging. So that's a very interesting area of research. There's people here within my division that are very interested in that, and it gets crazy complicated. Like one guy in our is working in India, right? So I don't know, there's a large number of languages people speak.
Yes.
You can get all
Yes.
of these combinations of languages. So that's just, so you've sort of touched on a very interesting area of study. Like in the study that we're doing, the big cognitive study that I've been talking about, we're doing so much else that's so complicated that I said, okay, I'm not going to deal with that. I want people that were in elementary school, we're doing that in English because this is
I see.
too complicated.
It takes it to another level. It's like the 3D chess.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
it's very interesting because outside the United States, I believe most countries people are at least bilingual.
yeah. In science, I see it. We're sort of very privileged. Almost anywhere you go, if there's a conference, everyone
Yeah.
speaks English there. So
Yeah.
we're sort of Americans, we're sort of privileged not having to speak another language, but it would probably be good to learn one. And there's a lot
Yeah.
about that.
Yeah. So can we enhance cognitive function at a later age without pharmacological interventions? And I think you were saying that you can.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's been, so there's different ways to study that question. Some of that is what I would call sort of the way that I've been discussing it is epidemiologically. We can look at people, we can study their brains, we can see the things they've done during their life, we can see who's doing better than others. We can say, oh, given this amount of brain change, these people are doing better. So we can look at specific things like we can quantify physical activity, we can quantify networks of people that people deal with and look and see how they impact cognitive change. The other way, but that's all sort of just looking at it's sort of epidemiologic. We're just looking at the data that we see. The other thing that you can do, or as a more of an intervention study, where you say, oh, we think that this kind of activity might be helpful for someone. Let's take people to a study and randomize them. So let's say exercise. That's because that's something that I've done. There's a lot of evidence that aerobic exercise is really good for cognition. We could take couch potatoes, people who are not exercisers, randomize them into two groups, exercise versus something else, like we did stretching and toning, do that over time and actually see, does this exercise impact brain? By the end, are the people who are exercising doing better than the people who didn't exercise? So you can use clinical trials to try to look at those, and that's a whole strong area of research also. So in aging, but also in a lot of other for children with learning problems, etc. But one thing that's really pretty clear is that aerobic exercise clearly, in many studies, has been associated with better cognition.
Let's get everybody starting on jumping jacks.
Something, and it's harder. There's other people that are looking at other interventions besides exercise. So there's sort of these various apps that have people do tasks and practice tasks, and people are working with that on a research level. Also, if you have people doing these tasks, does it increase their cognition in some way?
It's interesting because by saying that, you remind me the correlation between aerobic exercise having to do with the hippocampus and its growth, maybe
So you're asking, so what is it about aerobic exercise?
that's doing something to our brain.
Yeah, so it could be partially hippocampal. It could be other brain areas as well. I'm not the best person to answer that question. But we did do one study with older people. Well, actually, what we did, there's a bunch of exercise studies with older people. So we did a study more with younger people to see if aerobic exercise helped in younger people as well. And we were able to see real differences. We also did sort of what you're getting to structural brain imaging before and after, but the results there were not too clear, I think, just because we didn't have enough people to really fish that out of the data that we had. But there
I
are
see.
papers looking at that. What happens in the brain when you exercise? I think you could find another expert on that one to talk.
Well, I was going to say that if it's the hippocampus, there's that study, that famous study about the London cab drivers who have enlarged hippocampus. Maybe we should have everybody start reading maps or
Oh yeah, no. So yeah, that was a very influential study, and yeah, I mean it's clear
it's
that what
very interesting.
the kind of things that we do influence. I would say they influence the structure of the brain. They have bigger hippocampi, but probably also influence how we do things, how we solve problems, how we cope, deal with math or there's now today, you're taking a test almost any time you use your phone or you want to buy something online. There's a lot we have to do in order to cope with technology now.
So we've been talking about cognitive reserve and how important it is if you happen to develop neurodegenerative illnesses, such as different forms of dementia, and having a large cognitive reserve can help maintain cognitive function. And for those individuals, they show less cognitive impairment, even though they have the disease.
Right.
I'm wondering, and maybe this is not part of what's been studied, but is this also true for someone who suffers a stroke or brain hemorrhage in terms of mechanical function, like paralysis? Is the brain pathology for physical recovery the same as that for cognitive function when it comes to repair and recovery? Do we know?
That's a good question. I know a little bit about it, but not a lot. So I can say that, there are certain areas of the brain that are definitely associated with different movements, like the control of your hands, etc. I think, it's something, and then there's certain areas of the brain, let's say someone has a stroke in an area that's important for speech, right? Can someone recover from that? So, one can think about, and I'm not expert on this, but one could think about, well, can people begin to use other brain areas to recover? It's a different area of research than the cognitive aging that I've been talking about, because I've been talking about sort of this very slow, subtle change that happens with aging and with stroke and those kinds of diseases. We're talking about, a real hit to a specific brain
Yeah.
set of.
But you would almost think that if there's cognitive reserve there for one, the brain would be smart enough to utilize it for the other. I don't know.
I think that's part of what the rehabilitation can be, is figuring out a strategy that people could use with the capacities that they have left.
Yeah.
I've thought about it, but I have not done research in that area because it's complicated. And I think that there are certain brain areas that are just absolutely necessary for speech, let's say. You are correct that the idea of compensation, let's say, or a lot of the ideas that we've been talking about certainly apply to brain injury as well.
Okay, you need a new postdoc project. Like you need another project, right?
It's really funny. I mean, and there's people who can really speak. I've spoken with
Yeah.
people who can speak to this much better. And I met with a woman a while ago who's doing very nice research with specific kinds of stroke and looking at cognitive reserve in the face of that. When you it's funny to say it, but I've been doing this for a long time, but still you can't do everything. You sort of have to decide what you can do, what you can focus on, and what you have to leave to someone else to do.
You someone else.
Just the
You
way.
work on that, I'll work on this. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I want to look at a more practical side of what we're discussing. So if we know that there is this cognitive reserve and we know how to measure it, and it's been found to have this positive attribute when people become neurocognitive impaired, could we hypothetically take what is known about cognitive reserve and apply it in education and life experiences? So, could we potentially bring some of these ideas into schools and change the educational model? And I mean education in a broader term, like to include life experiences, exercise, diet, etc., and
Right.
teach children differently so they begin to build this brain property, if you will, at a higher level and increase their cognitive reserve in an earlier age.
Yeah, I think people sort of realize that stimulation that we give our children even before school, do you read to them? The quality of schools. I don't know if you need to develop an educational program that's a cognitive reserve educational program, but it's clear that there's various ways to look at the quality of schools and see how that is related to how people do later in life. Yeah, and I would say of all of the things I could think of, the quality of education that people get is really important. And even if people have specific learning problems, how you tailor the learning for them can be very important. Yeah. So all of these things, I thought you were going to ask a different question, but definitely with regards to school, that's that's been studied very carefully. Just unfortunately, there's examples. You can sort of look and see where people went to school and how good that school was using various metrics, and it really makes a difference. So yeah, I think that that's a straightforward one. I think no one will argue that the more we can enhance the quality of education, the better people are going to be off going forward. I thought you were going to ask about older people and what they do, but we could
Yeah.
talk about that separately. Yeah.
Yeah, it's more about the specific things, right? Because there's probably many things we can do, but there are probably specific things that have been studied to and show that on people have a higher level of cognitive reserve that maybe we can tap into those things and say these have a greater impact. There are many things you can do, but these have the greater impact.
Yes, I would say
So.
my point of view, one place to really start is exactly what we're talking about, is trying to ensure that the educational system is optimal. And there's always debate about what is the best way to teach this and the best way to teach that, but also it's to some degree it has to be tailored to the child also. That seems to be a very strong variable for almost anything that people study.
Um, so I want to ask a question that's completely different. I'm going to deviate from our conversation because I'd like to debunk a myth. I think it's a myth.
Yeah,
And that is the often quoted, I believe it's a misconception, that humans use only approximately 10% of their brain. Scientifically speaking, isn't it the case that humans use practically 100% of their brain, that pretty much the entire brain is used with different regions being more or less active depending on the activity that's being done?
I agree. Yes, that's I think that's really the case. And what we're finding more and more is that you can sort of isolate specific brain areas that are optimal, associated with a certain cognitive function. But really, the brain is working as a whole system all of the time, and everything is connected. So this idea that I don't know where that idea came from originally, but yeah, it's just not true.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we are coming to the hour and I need to close. So we have a tradition on the podcast where we ask our guests to provide some practical, actionable advice to our listeners. So the question for you is, given that most people don't generally spend time thinking about how their brain develops or the pathological changes that occur each time you learn something new, what advice would you give individuals to help increase their cognitive reserve so that they can be better equipped to fight off neurodegenerative diseases if they were to develop such illnesses in the future? Like, what could be a couple of things they could do today and going forward to enhance their future brain function?
That's, that's a good question. I think it differs by age. So let me start with me. I'm older. I'm 70. So what is there to do? So I think that the a lot of the things that we're talking about apply. Be involved in social networks, try to do things that are cognitively stimulating. So not talking about, going out and learning nuclear physics. It could be reading, it could be anything that you enjoy. It could be certain games that you like to play, and it doesn't have to be any special one. Exercise, fact of life, exercise, meditation, all of those things. Of course, taking care of your health as much as possible. So those are the kind of things I think are, it's sort of, and then another thing is diet, a healthy diet. It's been very clear, like Mediterranean diet or these kinds of diets really do make a difference. I'm trying to think of all the stuff that I've sort of I was never an exerciser my whole life.
Uh,
But at some point, looking at the data, I said, wait a second, I better be doing that. So I started walking up the stairs in my at the hospital. So a couple of times a week, I walk up to my office.
what floor are you on?
I'm on the 18th floor.
Oh,
So
wow.
yeah, so yeah, and I think for the people that about 10 years ago, I lived in the suburbs, we moved back to New York City. So you end up exercising a lot just
Yeah.
going on the subway. So exercise, meditation. So I started doing Tai Chi. Diet, I think, is something to really watch carefully because a healthy diet is important. Trying to have interpersonal contact, you know, if you're, if,
And for our younger listeners, the 30-year-olds or
so yeah,
20-year-olds?
I think it's sort of the same, but I think older people have more leisure time or sometimes to do that. So if you're younger people, I think, yeah, some people are very lucky in their jobs they find very stimulating. But I think a lot of the other things apply. The social nexus is very important. Exercise, diet, something stimulating that you like to do, get involved in something that you like to do. Now, for some people, that could be their work. It doesn't, but for other people, it's not. Yeah, I think those are just in general, the things that are very important.
And on that note, I thank you very much for sharing your time with us today, Dr. Stern. This has been very enlightening conversation, and I hope all listeners learned something new today. Thank you all for tuning in. As we close, I want to thank you for joining me on the Her Notebook podcast. I hope today's conversation brought you some knowledge and sparked new insights. If you enjoyed this episode, I humbly ask that you please remember to click the subscribe button below. Until next time, keep flipping your notebook pages and embrace the journey to a healthier, happier you. See you next week.